Unit 4, Lesson 3, Life During the Great Depression. Our lesson objective. Students will be able to explain how the American people and the U.S. government dealt with problems during the Great Depression. Our essential question, how did the average American citizen respond to the Great Depression? Unit 4, Lesson 3, Vocabulary. Life and death situation of the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1932, the suicide rate rose by 30% in America. Many people could not cope with the failures and the financial ruin that they found themselves in and chose to commit suicide. What were the living conditions like for the average American? Well, thousands of Americans could not pay their mortgages or rent and lost their homes. Many, in fact, were forced to live in cardboard shacks that they built in public parks and spaces. Those shacks were called shanties, and these parks became known as shanty towns. Amongst the residents, they referred to them as Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover and his failures. Where empty pockets were known as Hoover flags, and newspapers were Hoover blankets. Here's a picture of a shanty town in Central Park, New York, 1930. Those shanty towns were known as Hoovervilles throughout America, not just on the East Coast, where hard times are still hoovering over us, as depicted by the children and their signs here. With so many people unemployed, the Depression era began the era of the hobos. Hobos were the unemployed workers who rode the rails in the United States. They typically took any job they could, never spending too long in any one place. The Great Depression forced an estimated 4 million adults to leave their homes in search of food and lodging on the road. There were so many hobos throughout America that they came up with an actual code, a written language with pictograms that would tell a story. A cross was known as angel food, where food was served to hobos after a sermon. A triangle with hands meant that the homeowner had a gun. A horizontal zigzag meant that there was a barking dog. A square missing its top line said that it was safe to camp in that spot. A top hat and a triangle signified that the owner had wealth. And a spearhead was meant as a warning to defend yourself. And with so many people out of work or unable to find work, and so many people hitting the road in search of better opportunities, soup kitchens began to pop up. This is where millions of Americans, being out of work and could not provide food for their families, people lined up for food at soup kitchens that were run by charities. After waiting in line, sometimes for hours, they received bread and a bowl of soup. This was usually the only meal they would eat all day. Notorious gangster Al Capone opened the first soup kitchen in Chicago on Thanksgiving Day, 1930. This particular soup kitchen, shown in the picture here, was sponsored by Al Capone in 1931. The main causes of the Dust Bowl, which was the largest ecological disaster in American history. First, there was a drought. There was just simply not enough water for crops to sustain their yield. There was high winds along the plains, which caused a loss of the dry topsoil in arid, drought-ridden conditions. Next, the overproduction of crops left a lack of nutrients critical for soil survival, and there was little to no conservation in the 1920s and 1930s. All of these factors led to a loss of prairie grass due to overplowing and overmanipulation and overproduction of the land, where too much work on the soil caused it to become a fine, dust-like consistency. In previous decades, the federal government had given away 160-acre plots of land to encourage settlement and farming in the region. The farmers who settled in the area plowed under the native grasses that had evolved to survive periodic droughts, leaving the topsoil exposed. When years of drought descended on the area starting in 1930 and 1931, the dry topsoil was swept up in massive dust storms. Dust drifted like snow, and windstorms left areas of the Midwest covered in inches of dust. Those areas shown, Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and South Dakota in the north, Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas in central, and New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas in the southern United States. The airborne dust was a serious health hazard, even causing death in some cases. The drought and dust storms also destroyed the economy of the region, which was already reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Tens of thousands of destitute farmers abandoned the region, many moving to California to seek agricultural work. Part of the nation shown on the map was known as the Dust Bowl, where blowing dust would turn the sky black. Many families abandoned their homes and possessions and fled to California, especially those from Oklahoma and Kansas, which were hard hit. Those families who fled Oklahoma and Kansas became known as Okies. During the Depression, more than 750,000 farmers lost their farms. On top of that, farmers in the plains were hit with severe droughts. Without rain, crops could not grow or hold the fertile topsoil in place. Much of it blew away in these powerful dust storms that lasted for an entire decade. Storms that blew so much dust, they would build and bury machinery in a barn lot, cover entire barns and houses in 8 to 10 feet of dirt. Pictured here is a dust storm in Spearman, Texas, April 1935, getting ready to cover a factory and a town in dust. Many of the impoverished Dust Bowl immigrants to California settled in temporary shanty communities. Safety and disease were major concerns in these makeshift encampments. To help poor migrants, the Roosevelt administration created the Resettlement Administration. Among other things, this New Deal program built dozens of camps to house Dust Bowl migrants in California. The severity of this ecological disaster led many to flee. This led to displacement and migration patterns in America. Migrant families moved to the West Coast as quickly as they could. The migrant mother of the Great Depression. The Resettlement Administration was unpopular in many California communities because residents didn't want Okies, a disparaging term for the migrants, staying in their towns. To build support for its programs, the Resettlement Administration hired several photographers to take pictures to sway public opinion. Dorothea Lange, who owned a successful photography studio in San Francisco, was one of the photographers hired. Lange traveled up and down the West Coast taking photos of impoverished migrants and the conditions they faced. Lange's most famous photograph, which later became known as Migrant Mother, depicts Florence Owens Thompson and 3 of her 7 children at their makeshift shelter in Nipomo, California. Thompson, who was Cherokee, had moved from Oklahoma to California with her husband in the late 1920s, years before the Dust Bowl. Thompson claimed decades later that Lange had promised her that she wouldn't publish the photo. However, Lange sent it to the Resettlement Administration and to the San Francisco News. The news published the photo in a story about Thompson's camp. Over time, it became an iconic image, with many citing it as evidence of the terrible conditions facing Americans during the Great Depression. How does the migrant mother reflect the effects of the Great Depression and the lives of average Americans.